What is up? It's the Pro Football Focus Fantasy Podcast. My name is Jeff Ratcliffe, and it is Monday, May 18th. We had some German soccer this weekend. Get excited. Bundesliga. And that is one word I never thought I would say on this very podcast. But anyway, an interesting Monday, a little bit of news out there, so we'll talk about that. And I want to dive into a topic that I don't think I've ever explored before, but I think is a very interesting one, especially as we look forward to the season. Hey, wide receiver cornerback matchups are big. Shadow coverage is big. But I don't ever remember talking about the corners who shadowed at the college level. So I actually dug through the data and took a quick peek at this year's class. So we'll look at the top corners, basically corners who went in the first two rounds, and any of them who shadowed last year. So really interesting stuff here. Fascinating. One of them very, very intriguing to me. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but I want to dive into the news before we get to that. First and foremost, Ben Roethlisberger throwing passes. He's back, throwing to Juju, James Conner, Ryan Switzer. So throwing with obviously some of the vets here. No Deontay Johnson included in that list. No, Chase Claypool in that list or the tight ends, but it doesn't really matter to me. The key is that he's going to be back on the field. And I've talked sort of ad nauseum about how that is going to have just a healthy impact from a fantasy standpoint on Johnson, on Juju. I don't know about James Conner. I'm not going to go that far, but at least on those guys for sure. I don't expect Ben Roethlisberger to be the Ben Roethlisberger that we knew, obviously before this injury back in 2018. I mean, hey, that was a historic year. Anytime you can top 5,000 passing yards, it's historic. I don't expect that, but I also, don't expect him to be terrible. I'm going to come in. He's going to sling the ball around the yard. That's going to help these guys out, and I really do think we see Deontay Johnson break out. Give me him in the 9th round all day long. Give me him in the 9th round. I will take it. So good stuff that he's on his way back here. Nayeem Hines popping a little bit in terms of the news because Frank Reich came out and said, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a game this season that Nayeem Hines has 10 catches. This is really unto itself the problem, the conundrum with the Indy backfield. Not only did they bring in Jonathan Taylor, Marlon Mack here regardless, but it's the fact that these guys, whoever's the early down guy, is kind of in a Derrick Henry situation where what are you hoping for? A catch a game? A catch and a half a game out of that player? They're not going to get much else because Hines is the specialist. It's the same issue, and I know a lot of people have asked me, well, why didn't you have David Montgomery in your Bell Cow article or on the Bell Cow podcast? It's because of Tarik Cohen. I mean, it's plain and simple. Tarik Cohen is a pass down back. He's gonna be heavily involved. That takes a lot of work off the plate of a guy like David Montgomery. In this instance here, it takes a lot of work off the plate of whoever is the lead back. Early in the season, maybe it's Marlon Mack. Eventually, it's going to be Jonathan Taylor. They didn't spend that pick on him for him to be in a full-blown committee. He's a superior player. But if you remember, heading in to the draft, one of the questions a lot of folks had was, how good is he in the passing game? Didn't see much his first two seasons. Last year, yes, there was an uptick. But how good is he? Can he truly be a 3-down back? Obviously has the size. Obviously has the speed to be an NFL feature running back. But if he doesn't have the chops in the passing game, then, or if he's in a situation like this, then he's not going to add that element. And going back to Derrick Henry, the reason why Henry is so valuable for fantasy is obviously he's not going to do anything in the passing game. Even though he's like crazy off the charts efficient with his receptions, he's not going to do much there from a volume standpoint. The volume comes in the run game, and it's crazy volume. Any running back who can threaten or, top 300 carries like Henry just did, that's massively valuable. I don't think we see that. Even if Taylor had the backfield to himself, I don't think we see that with Taylor. It's just something to consider here, and especially when you hear a coach. Now, is this hyperbole that he could catch 10 balls? I mean, sure, to a degree. he's not saying like, oh, he's going to. It wouldn't surprise me. So maybe it isn't hyperbole. Maybe reaction to it has been hyperbolic. But regardless, something to consider with Jonathan Taylor. One of the reasons why I'm not overly bullish on him in my season-long rankings. In Dynasty rookie rankings, yes, he's my number 2. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the only guy I have ahead of him. But at least in the short term here, you have to consider this, certainly. Not just Marlon Mack, but Nayeem Hines. Additionally here, the Chargers saying that they were considering Cam Newton. That, of course, is not going to happen now because Justin Herbert, essentially them drafting Justin Herbert, that locks them into Justin Herbert for, and I would say conservatively, let's say 2.5 to 3 years, because why I give it 2.5 is he could be under center only half of this season. So typically by the time we get close to when they would pick up that 5th year option, that's how long of a leash he's likely going to have, unless it is an absolute disaster, like a Deshaun Kaiser disaster, then he's going to get at least that long. So Cam Newton is not going to be in the cards there. Where the heck does Cam Newton go? Where does he go? If New England's not going to take him, he is going to be a backup, which is kind of crazy to think. I know people don't love Cam Newton. There's a lot of people who don't love him. I get it. I understand why they don't love him. But he's been one of the better starting quarterbacks. And I don't mean like best, but when you look at like, is he top 16? Is he on the right side of average? He has been for a good chunk of his career. And now like can't find work. Kind of crazy. It's a statement of how fast things move in the NFL. It really is nuts. But it does. It moves so quickly. So there we go. Cam Newton there. I'm not looking at, I have Cam Newton on one of my dynasty rosters. I'm not looking to drop him at this point. But at the same time, I am not overly optimistic that I end up getting more out of him going forward. So unfortunately, that's sort of where we stand. We're at, sort of in limbo with Cam Newton right now. So there you go. Little bit of news. Just a little bit here in mid-May when typically not much is going on. Anyway, but as I said, one of the things that I was really intrigued with, so I cover the wide receiver cornerback matchups every single week in season, and I even did that the last 2 years for XFL and AAF. And I found that in XFL and AAF, there was no shadow coverage. Just never happened. In the NFL, it's going to depend on the week. It's going to depend on the matchup. There are certain teams where you can just say, yeah, they are not going to shadow. But most teams will sprinkle it in at some point, and there are some teams who are going to use it every week. New England, basically from the Belichick tree. So New England, Detroit, Miami, those teams use a heck of a lot of shadow. There are some teams who will sprinkle it in if they're facing, some of the studs of the world, the DeAndre Hopkins, Julio Jones types, then they'll sprinkle it in. But something we haven't talked about is whether or not these guys are actually capable of shadow coverage in that, do they have experience at the college level? I don't remember ever talking about it, me personally, and I don't know if anybody else even talks about it because, hey, I don't think it's a common topic. Most people really don't care. But as a fantasy audience, we do care a little bit, right? A little bit. Care who these shadow guys are. So I dug into the data, and I wanted to basically just go through the top drafted corners to see who shadowed. And this is just in 2019. I didn't go any further than last year. But who shadowed last year and who didn't? So in total, there were, 9 corners taken in the first 2 rounds. So I looked at those 9. Jeff Okudah, CJ Henderson, Aj Terrell, Damon Arnett, Noah Igbenogane. After him is Jeff Gladney, Jaylen Johnson, Trayvon Diggs, and Christian Fulton. So there you go, the top 9. Now out of that group, I'll just go in order. So first and foremost, Okudah, and I can say this for Arnett as well. They played their sides. They almost didn't move at all last year. So they just played their sides. That was it at Ohio State. No shadow whatsoever. Now, The guys in between them, however, CJ Henderson and Aj Terrell, were asked to shadow. Now, I saw some movement with them, but one game for each player in particular where they shadowed. So for Henderson, it was when Florida played LSU, and Henderson was charged with shadowing Jamar Chase. So it was pretty clear who Florida identified as their best receiver on the field for LSU, and it wasn't Justin Jefferson, okay? As you'd probably figure if you watched LSU play. So pretty interesting there. And in breaking this game down, well, Chase got the best of him. He had 4 catches on 7 targets for 89 yards and 2 touchdowns. But Henderson did also have 2 PBUs, so he got his hand on 2 of 7 targets, not bad. This is one of those where I'm not going to freak out over CJ Henderson, though, because as I just said, Chase is a rock star. Chase is going to be, for fantasy purposes, I can't wait till he gets to the NFL. But I did find that one interesting, just given, who he could potentially have lined up against that, certainly they prioritized Jamar Chase in that contest. So let's talk about Aj Terrell. And the matchup that I saw shadow out of Terrell came early in the season against Texas A&M, against Jamon Osborne. And that one was pretty interesting because Terrell basically took him out of the game. Not that we would have expected Osborne to dominate or anything. He had 3 catches on 4 targets against Terrell, 24 yards though, and actually negative yardage after the catch, -2 yards after catch. So basically, as soon as he caught the ball, he was stopped. So I think that bodes well for Terrell. Terrell's going to be a really interesting player at the pro level. I dig him just from, obviously from what we know. We know him well because we've seen a whole heck of a lot of Clemson over the last couple of years. But, a few of the factors about him that I like the most, first and foremost, decent length, obviously here at 6'1". He steps into a situation, though, where he has a very needy Atlanta Falcons team. So I think the other question, though, is, when you're in this division and you have to face the likes of Michael Thomas, you have to face, Mike Evans, who historically teams tend to shadow Evans more than they shadow Chris Godwin. Do we see Terrell shadowing immediately? It's happened. I've seen rookie shadow before. It's not like that would be an unprecedented thing. Even though it is a big learning curve for corners, do they lean on him in that way? We'd seen Atlanta historically shadow, even though this is a slightly different regime, obviously, in place than the last time we saw it on a consistent basis. But this would be interesting. They could potentially lean on him, and he does have some experience in that regard. So something to note there with Aj Terrell. Moving down through the next picks. So I mentioned Arnett already. No shadows from Igbinoghene. There were 2, however, from Jeff Gladney. So Jeff Gladney, TCU, shadowed both against Texas and against Baylor. And if you know the receivers from those teams, maybe you already know who he shadowed. But let's talk about it. So against Texas, he shadows Colin Johnson. So yeah, Devin Duvernay, I know. Okay, he was the top receiver, the top drafted receiver out of this group. But the thing is, Duvernay is a slot receiver, right? So Gladney, when you consider Jeff Gladney, he's not going to be shadowing the slot receiver. It's not going to happen. So it makes sense that he was on Johnson. Johnson was heavily targeted in this game, 11 targets. Gladney did allow 6 receptions for 84 yards, but no touchdowns. Managed to get 2 PBUs in that contest as well. So, relatively solid performance there. It wasn't like a rock star performance, but given the volume, he was able to hold Colin Johnson in check. So I think that bodes well. Now, the other matchup, and if you know, so Colin Johnson's a pretty big dude. This next one makes sense. So the other situation where he shadowed was against Baylor. And the big dude there, Denzel Mims. So he shadows against Denzel Mims in that contest, which that one was in week 11. So it was early November. In that contest against Denzel Mims, Gladney saw 7 targets, allowed Mims to catch 4 of them for 51 yards. Mims did get in the zone on one of them, But another one where, you didn't have much yak here, only 9 yards of yak out of Mims in that, out of those 51 yards. 2 PBUs. Mims did drop a catch, though, or drop a ball in that contest. But either way, those are, so those are pretty big assignments for Jeff Gladney. When we're thinking about just, again, the possibility could these guys shadow at the pro level, Minnesota is a team that certainly has used shadow coverage. Xavier Rhodes was one of the better shadows for a while before he obviously he hit the downslope of his career, and that happened certainly this last season, but one of the better shadow corners. I think it makes perfect sense that the Vikings get a guy who has some experience there in shadow coverage. Then we could see this happen as early as this year, certainly. So that one's interesting. When you connect the dots on some of these things, it is pretty interesting. So he was the last of the first round guys. He went at pick 31. There were 3 second round guys, and that's where I stopped. I didn't go any deeper than that. Out of those 3, so you have Jaylen Johnson, Trayvon Diggs, and Christian Fulton. Diggs and Fulton did not shadow. And in fact, really both of them pretty much played their side. Didn't see much movement from them. Jaylen Johnson would move around, and I did identify a shadow for him that came against Oregon State. And if you're like a deep dynasty person, you probably know Isaiah Hodgins. That's who he shadowed in that contest. So in that game, which came in week 7 of the college season, this was another one where, and this isn't a big surprise, so target volume doesn't really concern me at the college level, because if you have a good receiver, typically you're going to throw the freaking ball to that good receiver at the college level. Whereas at the pro level, pretty much everybody on the field is really good. So if you're going to target corners specifically, you're going to pick on corners. Tom Brady, if he has a rookie out there, is going to go after that rookie, which could be very interesting. Just talking about Aj Terrell there. Anyway, 12 targets against Jaylen Johnson when he was covering Isaiah Hodgins. So he had 12 targets. He caught 6 of them, though, for 61 yards, 2 PBUs for Johnson, and no touchdowns. So not a bad performance there against Hodgins, despite all of the volume being thrown at him. So I think that bodes well there for Jaylen Johnson. He's a guy who could have went in the first round for sure. Wouldn't have surprised anybody. Ends up going at pick 50 to a team who also historically in recent history has shown a propensity to use some shadow coverage in the Chicago Bears. So thinking about it, could these guys pan out to or end up being guys who will shadow? I think Gladney makes a ton of sense. Terrell and Johnson make sense that we'll see some shadow coverage out of them in the future. As for Henderson, I mean, he went to Jacksonville, and we know that, for a while, Jacksonville with Jalen Ramsey, we knew they were going to shadow, especially when they're squaring off against the Texans. Jalen Ramsey's going to shadow DeAndre Hopkins. So I think the fact that these guys go to teams who in recent history have shown that propensity makes a lot of sense. There are teams in the league who don't use shadow coverage. And if those guys went to those teams, it would have been a bit of a head scratcher for me. That didn't happen. There are teams especially when you look down at last year's shadow coverage matrix. So if you're not familiar, the shadow coverage matrix is a little chart that I put together over at PFF. It breaks down whether a team used shadow coverage on the defensive side of the ball in a given week, and then also the stats of those shadow situations. It's a really cool at-a-glance chart that you can use if you're ever thinking will this team use shadow coverage? So last year, some of the teams who just did not use shadow coverage. Now, Atlanta was one of them. And that's why I'm I don't know about AJ Terrell, but they have used shadow coverage recently. I think sometimes you do this. You may not use shadow coverage because you don't have anybody to shadow, anybody who's capable of doing that. The Jets didn't use it. The Raiders didn't use it at all. Eagles, Steelers, Seahawks, 49ers, and I think that's it. So everybody else used it at least 1 week, and some teams would use it almost every week. Teams like I mentioned, New England, Detroit, they're using it almost every week. Buffalo used it a lot down the stretch. New Orleans used it a lot early, didn't use it much down the stretch. The Giants used it the first 3 weeks with Janoris, and then that didn't happen anymore. But, anyway, it's a cool tool or a cool chart to look at. And when you look at these guys, I do think that ultimately their names are going to appear on the shadow coverage matrix going forward. So anyway, some cool insight there into some cornerbacks. Gives us an excuse to talk about these rookies from a slightly different angle than what we've been looking at this class. So that's going to wrap it up for me today. But in the meantime, you can head on over to PFF.com if you do want to look at the shadow coverage matrix. You got to be a subscriber, but hey, it's worth it. I know it's tough times out there. So again, I've said this before. If you don't have it, don't feel the need to spend it. But if you do have it, it is worth it because you get an entire year of a subscription. And access to all sorts of goodies. So go check that out, PFF.com. Of course, you can follow along with me on Twitter at Jeff Ratcliffe and on Instagram at Jeff Ratcliffe. And, of course, use that hashtag RatPack. That way I know you're a listener of the pod. We got some more fun stuff planned for this week, so we'll continue on tomorrow with another edition of the pod. Until then, for PFF, I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and I'm out of here.